Dad always called me the family disappointment, but that night when I was bleeding in the ER and the surgeon looked at him and said, "Sir, your daughter owns this entire wing," his face went white. The fluorescent lights above us flickered like dying stars, casting harsh shadows across the sterile tiles where my blood had pooled just minutes before. I could hear the distant beeping of machines, the hurried footsteps of nurses, and somewhere in the chaos, my father's voice demanding answers that no one seemed willing to give him. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear, that particular cocktail of desperation that only emergency rooms can brew. What Dad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had walked these halls 1,000 times before, not as a patient, but as someone whose name was etched in gold on a plaque he had never bothered to read. The irony wasn't lost on me that the place he was about to discover my worth was the same place where I had been saving lives while he told everyone I was wasting mine. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I caught glimpses of familiar faces, doctors and nurses who knew me by a different name, in a different capacity, and I wondered if tonight would finally be the night the truth came out. The automatic doors whooshed open like a curtain rising on the final act of a play I had been rehearsing for years. In that moment, suspended between consciousness and whatever came next, I realized that sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of timing. The beeping of the heart monitor beside me seemed to echo the rhythm of secrets about to be revealed. My father's voice grew distant as the anesthesia began to take hold, but I could still hear him arguing with someone about insurance, about costs, about how his disappointing daughter couldn't possibly afford the kind of care they were giving her. Before I share the rest of my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. This story is about more than just one night in an emergency room. It's about the weight of carrying truth in silence. Growing up, I was always the odd one out in my family. While my siblings pursued what Dad called respectable careers, I seemed to drift from one thing to another, never quite fitting the mold he had cast for success. My older brother became a lawyer, exactly like Dad wanted, and my sister married a doctor, which gave her instant credibility at every family gathering. But me, I was the one who dropped out of medical school after 2 years, the one who couldn't stick to anything, the one who Dad introduced his friends with that particular tone of resigned disappointment. At every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every birthday party, I was the cautionary tale, the example of wasted potential. Dad would shake his head and tell anyone who would listen about how I had thrown away my medical education, how I was too sensitive for the real world, how I lacked the discipline that my siblings had inherited. The conversations always followed the same pattern. My brother would talk about his latest case, my sister would share stories from the hospital where her husband worked, and I would sit quietly, picking at my food, while Dad explained to everyone why I was the family failure. He had a way of making disappointment sound like concern, of wrapping his criticism in the language of parental worry. "I just don't understand what happened to her," he would say, as if I weren't sitting right there. "She had so much potential." The worst part wasn't the criticism itself, but the way the rest of the family had learned to expect it, to accept it as simply the natural order of things. My mother would try to change the subject, but even her attempts at protection felt like acknowledgement that I needed protecting, that I couldn't defend myself because there was nothing to defend. When I tried to explain that I was happy, that I was doing meaningful work, Dad would interrupt with questions about salary, about benefits, about the kind of concrete measures of success that he understood. My vague answers only seemed to confirm his suspicions that I was hiding something, though he assumed it was failure rather than the truth. The truth was that I had never really left medicine at all. After dropping out of medical school, I had found other ways to stay connected to the world that had always called to me. I started volunteering at the free clinic downtown, then at the children's hospital, then anywhere that would let me help. The official story was that I was finding myself, which was code for failing to launch in my family's vocabulary. But while Dad was telling everyone about my lack of direction, I was learning about healthcare from the ground up, seeing the system from angles that medical school had never shown me. I discovered that healing wasn't just about diagnoses and prescriptions, but about understanding the human cost of illness, about fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves. The work was invisible to my family because it didn't come with a title they recognized or a salary they could brag about. When I eventually started my own consulting firm, specializing in healthcare administration and patient advocacy, Dad assumed it was another one of my phases. He never asked for details, never wanted to hear about the hospitals I was helping to improve their patient outcomes, never cared about the policies I was writing to protect vulnerable populations. In his mind, if I wasn't wearing a white coat or carrying a medical bag, I wasn't really in medicine at all. The irony was that my work was making a real difference, but because it happened behind the scenes, because it didn't fit his narrow definition of success, it might as well have been invisible. Year after year, I watched my siblings receive praise for achievements that were measurable and public, while my own work remained hidden, acknowledged only by the patients and families who benefited from it. I had learned to carry my accomplishments like a secret, to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than in recognition from a family that had already decided what I was worth. The phone calls started coming in around 10 p.m., which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. My sister's voice was tight with panic when she told me that Dad had been in an accident, that he was being taken to General Hospital, that we needed to get there immediately. I had been working late in my home office, reviewing patient satisfaction surveys from 3 different hospitals, when the world suddenly shifted into emergency mode. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys, and I realized that despite all our complicated history, despite years of disappointment and dismissal, the thought of losing my father terrified me more than I had expected. The drive to the hospital felt like moving through a nightmare, every red light an eternity, every familiar street sign a reminder of how much could change in a single night. I had made this same drive countless times before, but never as a family member. Never with my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, the fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh, institutional blue. I could see the emergency room entrance from where I parked, the automatic doors opening and closing like a mouth breathing in the night air. My siblings were already there when I arrived, huddled together in the waiting room with expressions I had never seen before. My brother's usually confident lawyer facade had cracked, revealing something raw and frightened underneath. My sister was crying quietly, her husband holding her hand while staring at the floor with the practiced composure of someone who had seen too much medical drama. When they saw me, there was a moment of surprise, as if they had forgotten I existed, as if the family failure couldn't possibly be relevant in a real crisis. But then my sister stood up and hugged me, and I realized that whatever our differences, whatever Dad's disappointments, we were still family when it mattered most. The waiting room smelled like fear and industrial coffee, that particular combination of human anxiety and institutional indifference. We sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs, taking turns asking the reception desk for updates, getting the same polite non-answers that families get when the medical staff doesn't know what to tell them. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time moves differently in hospital waiting rooms, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of worry and hope. My brother kept checking his phone, my sister kept crying, and I kept thinking about all the times I had been on the other side of these conversations, helping families navigate exactly this kind of uncertainty. But now I was just another worried daughter. Just another person whose world had been turned upside down by the randomness of accident and injury. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was back in a hospital, but this time as a visitor rather than someone who belonged there, someone who had earned the right to be there through years of service and sacrifice that my family had never bothered to understand. Finally, around 3 a.m, a doctor appeared and called our name. Dr. Rodriguez looked tired, but professional, the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many nights like this one, too many families like ours waiting for news that could change everything. She led us to a small consultation room that smelled like disinfectant and recycled air, the kind of space designed for conversations that no one wants to have. Dad had been in a serious car accident, she explained, with internal injuries that required immediate surgery. He was stable, but the next few hours would be critical. The medical terminology washed over my siblings like a foreign language, but I found myself translating automatically, understanding not just the words, but the implications behind them. When Dr. Rodriguez finished her explanation and asked if we had any questions, I found myself speaking up, asking about surgical procedures and recovery timelines with a familiarity that surprised everyone in the room. My siblings looked at me strangely, as if I had suddenly started speaking fluent Chinese, but Dr. Rodriguez answered my questions with the kind of professional respect that she might show to a colleague. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was being taken seriously by anyone in my family, even if it was only by proxy, even if it was only because I was asking the right questions at the worst possible moment. We were told we could wait in the surgical family lounge, a slightly more comfortable version of the emergency room waiting area, with softer chairs and gentler lighting that was supposed to make the waiting easier. But nothing makes waiting easier when someone you love is fighting for their life on an operating table. I offered to get coffee for everyone, partly because I needed to move, partly because I knew where the good coffee was hidden in this hospital, knowledge that I couldn't explain to my siblings without revealing things I wasn't ready to reveal. As I walked the familiar hallways, I saw faces I recognized, nurses and technicians who knew me by name, who nodded with the kind of professional acknowledgement that comes from shared experience. But I couldn't stop to talk, couldn't explain why I was here as a family member rather than in my usual capacity. The coffee machine was exactly where I remembered it, tucked away in a small alcove near the administrative offices, and as I fed quarters into the slot, I realized that this might be the night when all my carefully guarded secrets finally came to light. The surgery took longer than expected, which Dr. Rodriguez explained was normal, but felt like torture to those of us waiting. My siblings dozed fitfully in their chairs, but I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about Dad lying on that operating table, about all the conversations we had never had, about all the disappointments that suddenly seemed so much smaller than they had just hours before. I found myself pacing the hallways, moving through the hospital like I owned the place, which in a way I did, though that was a truth I had never planned to share. The night shift staff moved around me with practiced efficiency, and I caught glimpses of the complex machinery that keeps a hospital running, the invisible network of care and administration that most people never see. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Rodriguez finally emerged from the surgical suite, still in her scrubs, but with a smile that told us everything we needed to know before she said a word. Dad was going to be okay, she said. The surgery had been successful, and he would be moved to recovery within the hour. The relief was overwhelming, like a dam breaking inside my chest, and I found myself crying for the first time since the whole nightmare had begun. My siblings were hugging each other and crying too, and for a moment we were just a family again, united by love and relief and the particular gratitude that comes from almost losing someone you care about. Dr. Rodriguez said we could see him briefly once he was settled in recovery, but warned us that he would be groggy from anesthesia and probably wouldn't remember much of the conversation. As we gathered our things and prepared to move to the recovery ward, I realized that we were about to enter a different phase of this crisis, one where Dad would be conscious and asking questions, one where the familiar dynamics of our family would reassert themselves. I had no idea that the next few hours would change everything, that the truth I had been carrying for years was about to come out in the most unexpected way possible. As we walked toward the recovery ward, following Dr. Rodriguez down corridors that I knew better than my own neighborhood, I felt like I was walking toward a reckoning that had been years in the making. The automatic doors opened before us, and I stepped through them knowing that on the other side, nothing would ever be the same again. The recovery ward was quieter than the emergency room, filled with the steady rhythm of machines monitoring heartbeats and breathing, the soft beeping that had become the soundtrack of my life in ways my family could never understand. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, pale against the white sheets, with tubes and wires connecting him to machines that were keeping careful track of his vital signs. My siblings approached his bedside tentatively, as if they were afraid he might break, but I found myself automatically checking the monitors, reading the numbers with the kind of practiced familiarity that comes from years of experience. When Dad's eyes fluttered open, they were unfocused at first, searching the room until they landed on each of us in turn. His voice was hoarse when he spoke, asking where he was, what had happened, the kinds of questions that families expect after surgery. My brother started to explain about the accident, but Dad interrupted him, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and for a moment I thought he was asking why I had come to the hospital at all. But then he clarified, "Why are the nurses treating you like you work here?" It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a physical blow, because I realized that, even in his post-surgical haze, he had noticed something that my siblings had missed. The way the staff had nodded to me in the hallways, the way they had spoken to me with professional respect, the way I had moved through the hospital like I belonged there. I opened my mouth to answer, to deflect, to change the subject the way I had been doing for years, but before I could speak, Nurse Patricia walked into the room. She was one of the senior nurses on the floor, someone I had worked with on countless patient care initiatives, someone who knew me well enough to forget that my family didn't know who I really was. "Dr. Morgan," she said, addressing me directly, "the family in room 314 is asking for you. They wanted to thank you personally for the new patient advocate program." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady beeping of Dad's heart monitor, which seemed to be beating faster now. My siblings stared at me with expressions of complete confusion, as if I had suddenly transformed into someone they had never seen before. Patricia realized her mistake immediately, her face flushing with embarrassment as she looked from me to my family and back again. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't realize you were here as a family member today." But the damage was done, the first crack in the carefully constructed wall I had built around my real life. Dad's eyes were sharper now, cutting through the fog of medication with the kind of focus that had made him successful in business. "Dr. Morgan," he repeated, his voice gaining strength. What is she talking about? I felt the weight of years of secrecy pressing down on me, all the carefully avoided conversations, all the deflected questions, all the times I had let him believe I was a disappointment rather than tell him the truth. But there was no deflecting now, no changing the subject, no escaping the moment that had been building for so long. "It's complicated, Dad," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. Patricia excused herself quickly, but I could see other staff members glancing into the room, recognizing me, probably wondering why I was standing at a patient's bedside instead of making my usual rounds. The truth was that I had been making rounds in this hospital for 3 years, not as a doctor in the traditional sense, but as something more complex, something that didn't fit into the neat categories my family understood. The story started 5 years ago, when I was volunteering at the free clinic downtown and met Mrs. Chin, an elderly woman who had been bounced between 3 different hospitals because no one wanted to deal with her complex case and lack of insurance. She was dying, not because her condition was untreatable, but because the system had failed her, because there was no one advocating for her care, no one fighting for her right to be treated with dignity and respect. I spent weeks navigating the bureaucracy, calling insurance companies, arguing with administrators, until finally I managed to get her the surgery she needed. But the experience opened my eyes to something I had never seen clearly before: the gap between medical care and patient advocacy, between healing and helping people access healing. That was when I realized that my path in medicine didn't have to look like everyone else's, that there were ways to save lives that didn't require a stethoscope or a prescription pad. I started my consulting firm with the money I had inherited from Grandma Rose, the grandmother who had always believed in me even when the rest of the family had written me off. The firm specialized in healthcare administration, patient advocacy, and system improvement, working with hospitals to create better patient outcomes and more efficient care delivery. It wasn't the kind of work that made headlines or earned immediate recognition, but it was the kind of work that changed lives, that made the difference between a patient getting the care they needed and falling through the cracks. Within 2 years, we had contracts with 17 hospitals across the state, and our patient advocacy programs had helped thousands of people navigate the complex world of medical care. But the real breakthrough came when I started working with General Hospital, the same hospital where Dad was now recovering, the same hospital where I had been spending 60 hours a week for the past 3 years. The hospital had been struggling with patient satisfaction scores, with insurance reimbursement issues, with the kind of systemic problems that were driving healthcare costs up and quality down. I proposed a comprehensive restructuring of their patient services, a new approach to care coordination that would save money while improving outcomes. The board was skeptical at first, but the results spoke for themselves. Patient satisfaction scores improved by 40%, readmission rates dropped by 25%, and the hospital saved over $2 million in the first year alone. That was when they offered me something I had never expected, a permanent position as Director of Patient Services, with my own budget, my own staff, and my own vision for how healthcare should work. But more than that, they offered me something even more valuable, the opportunity to create an endowment fund for uninsured patients, a way to ensure that people like Mrs. Chin would never again be denied care because they couldn't afford it. I had been quietly funding that endowment for 2 years, using the profits from my consulting work to create a safety net for the most vulnerable patients. The East Wing, where Dad was now recovering, had been renovated using money from that fund, though the plaque with my name on it was tucked away in a corridor that most visitors never saw. I had insisted on anonymity, partly because I didn't want recognition, but mostly because I knew that if my family found out, they would either think I was lying or wonder why I had never told them. The truth was that I had tried to tell them in small ways over the years. I had mentioned my consulting work, my involvement with healthcare policy, my passion for patient advocacy. But every time I brought it up, Dad would change the subject or make some comment about how I was playing at being important instead of doing real work. So I had learned to keep my professional life separate from my family life, to let them think I was a disappointment rather than fight for recognition that might never come. The irony was that while Dad was telling everyone about my lack of direction, I was being invited to speak at medical conferences, to consult on healthcare policy at the state level, to write articles for medical journals about patient advocacy and care coordination. My work was making a real difference, but because it happened behind the scenes, because it didn't fit the traditional model of medical success, it remained invisible to the people whose approval I had spent my whole life seeking. Now, standing in Dad's hospital room, I could see that invisibility dissolving in real time. My siblings were staring at me with expressions of complete bewilderment, as if I had suddenly revealed that I was leading a double life, which in a way I had been. Dad's eyes were sharp with the kind of focus that medication couldn't dull, and I knew that there would be no avoiding the conversation that was coming. I think I said carefully that we need to have a talk. But before I could explain anything, Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, and I could see immediately that she recognized me, that she was about to make the same mistake Patricia had made. "Ms. Morgan," she said, then corrected herself. "Dr. Morgan, I wanted to thank you personally for the new emergency protocol you developed. It probably saved your father's life tonight." The silence that followed was even more profound than before, broken only by the sound of my sister gasping, a small, sharp intake of breath that seemed to echo in the sterile room. Dr. Rodriguez looked around at our faces, realized that she had walked into something complicated, and tried to backtrack. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize this was a family situation. I can come back later." But Dad's voice stopped her before she could leave. "Wait," he said, his voice stronger now, cutting through the confusion with the kind of authority that had made him successful in business. "What did you just say about my daughter?" Dr. Rodriguez looked at me, clearly asking for permission to continue, and I found myself nodding, knowing that the moment I had been avoiding for years had finally arrived. "Your daughter," she said carefully, "is one of the most respected patient advocates in the state. The emergency protocol she developed has been adopted by hospitals across the region. It's probably saved hundreds of lives." Dad's heart monitor started beeping faster, and for a moment I was afraid that the shock might be too much for him, that learning the truth about my work might somehow undo the surgery that had just saved his life. But his eyes were clear now, focused on me with an intensity that I hadn't seen since I was a child. "Is this true?" he asked, and I could hear something in his voice that I had never heard before, something that might have been pride, or maybe just confusion, or maybe both. I nodded, unable to speak, watching as everything he thought he knew about me crumbled and reformed in the space of a few seconds. My brother found his voice first, asking the question that I knew was coming: "How long has this been going on?" But before I could answer, we were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. voices raised in what sounded like an argument, footsteps moving quickly across the linoleum floor. Through the open door, I could see two men in expensive suits approaching, flanked by hospital security, and I realized with a sinking heart that the night was about to get even more complicated. One of the men was Dr. Williams, the chief of staff, someone I had worked with closely on hospital policy, but who had never met my family. The other was someone I didn't recognize, but his bearing and the way the security guards deferred to him suggested he was someone important, someone whose presence in the hospital at this hour meant that something significant was happening. They stopped outside Dad's room, Dr. Williams checking his phone, the other man speaking in low, urgent tones to one of the security guards. I could feel the weight of their attention, the sense that whatever was happening in the hallway was somehow connected to us, to me, to the truth that was finally coming to light. Dr. Williams looked into the room, saw me standing beside Dad's bed, and his expression changed, became more formal, more careful. "Dr. Morgan," he said, stepping into the room, "we need to speak with you immediately. There's been a development." The man in the expensive suit stepped forward, and I could see now that he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from wielding real power, the kind of presence that makes everyone else in the room stand a little straighter. Dr. Williams cleared his throat and looked directly at me, his expression serious but respectful. "Dr. Morgan, this is James Patterson from the State Health Department. There's been an incident at Memorial Hospital across town, a critical situation involving their emergency protocols, and they're requesting your immediate consultation." The words hit the room like a physical force, and I could feel my family's eyes on me, their confusion deepening with each revelation that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew about my life. Patterson stepped forward, extending his hand to me with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for acknowledged experts. "Dr. Morgan, I apologize for the intrusion, especially given the family circumstances, but Memorial's emergency department is overwhelmed, and they specifically requested your emergency triage protocol. 3 hospitals have already implemented your system tonight, and the results have been remarkable." Dad's heart monitor was beeping steadily faster now, and I could see him struggling to process what he was hearing, to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the person these officials were describing. My sister was gripping her husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and my brother had that expression he got when he was trying to solve a particularly complex legal puzzle. Dr. Williams looked around the room, seemed to realize that he was in the middle of a family revelation, and spoke more carefully. "Perhaps this could wait until tomorrow," he suggested, but Patterson shook his head. "With respect, Doctor, people's lives are at stake. Dr. Morgan's protocols have already prevented what could have been a complete system failure at Memorial. They need her expertise now." The weight of the moment settled on me like a physical thing, the realization that my two worlds were finally colliding in the most dramatic way possible. I looked at Dad, lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that were monitoring his recovery, and I realized that this was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life. "Dad," I said quietly, "there are some things I need to tell you, but first I need to help those people at Memorial." His eyes met mine, and for the first time in years, I saw something that might have been respect, or at least curiosity, replacing the disappointment that had lived there for so long. "Go," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "We'll be here when you get back. And then we're going to have a very long conversation." Patterson was already moving toward the door, checking his phone, radiating the kind of urgency that comes from knowing that delays can cost lives. But before I could follow him, Dr. Williams spoke again, and his words changed everything. "Mr. Morgan," he said, addressing my father directly, "I realize this might not be the best time, but I think you should know something about your daughter. She doesn't just work here, she owns this wing." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls, the distant sound of elevators moving between floors, the muffled conversations from other rooms down the hall. Dad's eyes went wide, and for a moment I was afraid that the shock might be too much, that his recovering heart couldn't handle another revelation of this magnitude. "What did you just say?" my sister whispered, speaking for all of them. Dr. Williams looked at me, clearly asking for permission to continue, and I found myself nodding, knowing that there was no going back now, no way to keep the secret that had defined my life for the past 3 years. The east wing of this hospital, where your father is recovering, was renovated and equipped using funds from the Morgan Patient Care Endowment. Your daughter established that endowment and has been its primary benefactor. The equipment that's monitoring your father's vital signs, the surgical suite where he was operated on, the recovery protocols that are ensuring his care, all of that exists because of her generosity and vision. Dad tried to sit up in bed, wincing from the surgical incisions, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that I had never seen before. The East Wing, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. You own the East Wing. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway, watching as the implications of what he was learning began to sink in. My brother found his voice first, asking the question that I knew was coming. How is that possible? How could you afford something like that? The answer was complicated, involving years of careful investment, the success of my consulting firm, and the inheritance from Grandma Rose that I had never told them about. But before I could explain, Patterson spoke up from the doorway. Dr. Morgan's work has revolutionized patient care in this state. Her consulting firm has contracts with 23 hospitals, and her advocacy programs have saved the healthcare system millions of dollars while improving patient outcomes. She's being considered for a position with the state health department. The revelations were coming too fast now, each one building on the last, creating a picture of my life that was completely different from the story my family had been telling themselves for years. I could see them struggling to process it all, to understand how the daughter and sister they thought was a failure had been quietly building a career that was making a real difference in the world. Dad's eyes never left my face as Patterson continued, explaining about the emergency at Memorial, about how my protocols were being used across the state, about how my expertise was needed immediately. Sir, Patterson said, addressing my father with the kind of respect that comes from understanding the importance of family, your daughter is one of the most respected healthcare advocates in the region. What she's accomplished in just 5 years is extraordinary. I could see tears forming in Dad's eyes, but whether they were from pain, confusion, or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell us? It was the question I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure, the one that cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong between us over the years. Because every time I tried, you changed the subject or told me I was playing at being important. Because you had already decided what I was worth, and nothing I said seemed to change that. Because it was easier to let you think I was a disappointment than to fight for recognition that might never come. The truth hung in the air between us, raw and painful and necessary. Dr. Williams cleared his throat gently, reminding us that there were still people waiting for help at Memorial, but Dad held up his hand, asking for just a moment more. The plaque, he said suddenly, his eyes widening as he remembered something. In the main lobby, there's a plaque thanking the Morgan Family Foundation for their support. I saw it when they brought me in, but I thought it was a coincidence. Dr. Williams nodded. That's your daughter's foundation. She established it 3 years ago to support uninsured patients and fund medical equipment for rural hospitals. The foundation has provided over $5 million in support across the state. The number hit my family like a physical blow, and I could see them trying to process not just the amount, but the implications of what it meant, the scope of what I had been doing while they thought I was failing at life. Patterson was checking his watch now, the urgency of the situation at Memorial cutting through the emotional weight of our family reunion. Dr. Morgan, I hate to interrupt, but we really do need to leave. Lives are literally hanging in the balance. I looked at my family, at Dad lying in that hospital bed surrounded by equipment that I had helped purchase, at my siblings trying to reconcile the sister they thought they knew with the person they were discovering I had become. I have to go, I said, and for the first time in my adult life, it felt like they understood that what I was doing mattered, that it was important, that it was worthy of their respect. Dad reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who had just undergone major surgery. Go save lives, he said, and I could hear something in his voice that I had been waiting my whole life to hear. We'll be here when you get back, and I want to hear everything. Every single thing I missed, every achievement I didn't celebrate, every time I should have been proud and wasn't. I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding beginning to lift. I love you, Dad. I always have, even when it felt like you were disappointed in who I was becoming. He squeezed back, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I was never disappointed in who you were becoming. I was just too blind to see it. As I followed Patterson out of the room, I could hear my siblings starting to ask Dad questions, their voices filled with wonder and confusion and what sounded like pride. The hallway was busy with the normal late-night hospital activity, but everything felt different now, charged with the electricity of truth finally spoken. Dr. Williams walked beside me as we headed toward the elevator, and I could see him smiling slightly. You know, he said, in 3 years of working together, I never would have guessed that you came from a family that didn't know about your work. You've never seemed like someone who needed external validation. I considered this as we waited for the elevator, thinking about the years I had spent carrying my achievements like secrets, building a career that mattered while letting my family believe I was lost. Maybe I didn't need their validation, I said finally, but I wanted it. I wanted them to be proud, to understand that the path I chose was worthy even if it wasn't traditional. The elevator arrived, and as we stepped inside, Patterson was already on his phone with Memorial Hospital, coordinating the emergency response that would keep me away from my family for the next several hours. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was leaving them with the truth instead of hiding from it, like I was going to work that they finally understood was important, work that they could finally be proud of. The emergency at Memorial turned out to be exactly the kind of crisis that my protocols were designed to handle, a multi-car accident that had overwhelmed their emergency department, combined with a computer system failure that had created chaos in patient tracking and treatment prioritization. I spent the next 4 hours working with their staff, implementing the triage system that had become my signature achievement, coordinating with other hospitals to distribute the patient load, and ensuring that everyone received the care they needed despite the system failures. It was the kind of work that required every skill I had developed over the past 5 years, the kind of challenge that reminded me why I had chosen this path in the first place. By the time we had the situation under control, it was nearly noon, and I was exhausted but satisfied, knowing that we had probably saved lives through coordinated effort and systematic thinking. Patterson offered to drive me back to General Hospital, and during the 20-minute ride, he filled me in on something I hadn't expected. The state health department wanted to offer me a position as Director of Emergency Preparedness, a role that would involve coordinating disaster response across the entire state healthcare system. It was the kind of opportunity one had dreamed about but never thought would be possible, the chance to implement my ideas on a scale that could help thousands of people. When we pulled into the hospital parking garage, I realized that I was nervous about facing my family again, about dealing with the aftermath of the revelations that had changed everything between us. But I was also excited, hopeful in a way that I hadn't been in years, because for the first time they knew who I really was, what I had accomplished, why my work mattered. The elevator ride to Dad's floor felt like ascending toward a new version of my life, one where I didn't have to choose between family and career, between their approval and my own sense of purpose. When I walked into Dad's room, I found them exactly where I had left them, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere. My siblings looked at me with expressions of respect and curiosity instead of the polite tolerance I had grown accustomed to over the years. Dad was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had since the surgery, and when he saw me, his face lit up with something that looked remarkably like pride. "How did it go?" he asked, as if he finally understood that the question mattered, that my work was worth asking about. I told them about Memorial Hospital, about the lives we had saved, about the state position I had been offered, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like they were really listening, really understanding what I was trying to accomplish. My sister asked thoughtful questions about patient advocacy. My brother wanted to know about the legal frameworks I had developed for healthcare policy, and Dad just listened with the kind of attention that I had been craving for years. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, when I had finished explaining about the night's events. "I spent so many years worried about your lack of direction that I never bothered to look at where you were actually going." I was so focused on my own definition of success that I missed the fact that you were succeeding in ways I never could have imagined. The apology meant more to me than he could possibly know, not because I needed his validation to feel good about my work, but because I had spent so many years carrying the weight of his disappointment, letting it color my own feelings about my achievements. I should have fought harder to make you understand, I said. I should have insisted that you listen instead of just accepting that you never would. He shook his head. You shouldn't have had to fight for my attention or my respect. You shouldn't have had to prove your worth to your own father. I should have been paying attention, should have been asking the right questions, should have been proud all along. My siblings nodded in agreement, and I could see that this revelation had affected them too, had made them think about their own assumptions and blind spots. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, really talking, in a way that we hadn't done in years. They wanted to know everything: how I had started the consulting firm, how I had built relationships with hospitals across the state, how I had managed to keep such a significant part of my life hidden from them for so long. I told them about Mrs. Chin, about the free clinic, about all the patients whose lives had been improved by the work I was doing. I told them about the satisfaction I found in fixing systems instead of just treating symptoms, about the joy of helping people navigate the most frightening moments of their lives. Most importantly, I told them about the choice I had made to find my own path in medicine, to create a career that aligned with my values even if it didn't look like what they expected. As the sun began to set outside Dad's hospital room window, casting long shadows across the floor, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. The disappointment that had defined my relationship with my father for so many years had been replaced by understanding, by respect, by the kind of pride that I had always hoped for but never expected to receive. My siblings were making plans to visit my office, to see the foundation's work firsthand, to understand the scope of what I had been building while they thought I was drifting through life without purpose. Dad was already talking about how he could help, how his business connections might be useful for expanding the foundation's reach, how proud he was going to be to tell his friends about his daughter, the healthcare reformer. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a medical crisis, the very kind of emergency that my work was designed to handle, to finally bring the truth to light. The accident that could have killed my father had instead saved our relationship, had forced us into a space where secrets couldn't survive, where the truth had to come out whether we were ready for it or not. As visiting hours came to an end and my siblings prepared to leave, Dad asked me to stay for a few more minutes. When we were alone, he took my hand again and looked at me with eyes that were clear and focused despite his medication. I need you to know something, he said. I was never really disappointed in you. I was confused, frustrated, worried that you were wasting your potential, but never disappointed. You've always been extraordinary, even when I was too stubborn to see it. The words hit me harder than I had expected, and I found myself crying for the second time in 24 hours. But these were different tears, tears of relief and recognition and healing. I know, Dad, I said. I think I always knew, somewhere deep down. I just needed to hear you say it. He smiled, the first real smile I had seen from him since before the accident. Well, you're going to be hearing it a lot from now on. I have 20 years of pride to catch up on, and I intend to make sure everyone knows how remarkable my daughter is. As I prepared to leave, he had one more surprise for me. That state position they offered you, he said. I think you should take it. Not because I think you need the validation or the recognition, but because the state needs what you have to offer. You've spent 5 years proving that you can change healthcare one hospital at a time. Now you have the chance to change it for everyone. I kissed his forehead, feeling grateful for the accident that had brought us to this moment, for the crisis that had forced us to confront the truth about our relationship, for the opportunity to build something better on the foundation of honesty instead of assumption. Walking out of the hospital that night, I felt lighter than I had in years, no longer carrying the weight of secrets and misunderstandings that had defined my relationship with my family for so long. The parking garage was nearly empty, lit by the same harsh fluorescent lights that had greeted me the night before, but everything felt different now. I had entered this place as the family disappointment, the daughter whose life was a series of missed opportunities and wasted potential. I was leaving as someone whose work was recognized and valued, whose achievements were finally visible to the people whose opinions had mattered to me most. The drive home took me past the free clinic where my journey had really begun, past the offices where I had built my consulting firm, past the other hospitals where my protocols were saving lives every day. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like all the pieces of my identity were aligned, like the person I was in my professional life and the person I was in my family were finally the same person. The next morning, I would call Patterson and accept the state position, beginning a new chapter in my career that would allow me to implement my ideas on an even larger scale. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the truth that had finally been spoken, for the family that had finally learned to see me clearly, for the father who had finally found the words to tell me he was proud. Before I close this story, I want you to think about the people in your life who might be carrying achievements you've never bothered to discover, who might be making differences you've never taken the time to understand. Sometimes the most extraordinary work happens quietly, behind the scenes, in ways that don't fit our traditional definitions of success. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we've never really seen at all. My father and I lost 20 years to misunderstanding, to assumptions, to the failure to really listen to each other. But we found our way back through crisis, through truth, through the willingness to see each other clearly for the first time. It's never too late to ask the right questions, to look beyond your own expectations, to discover the hidden worth in the people you love.